Hello everybody, my name is Fabian and welcome to my geometric hoodie sew along. For this sew along, I'm going to be using McCall's 8249 as our base, meaning we're going to be building a design from this actual pattern. Very simplistic kind of hoodie. There's a hood, you have a contrast in the middle here, which is really cool. On the back of the pattern, you'll see the line drawings for the front and back view. We're going to be sticking with view B for this design. All I'm going to be doing is adding 2 new seam lines across the front and the back. And since this is a very symmetrical design, this will work very well. Suggested fabrics, and usually for a hoodie, you want to use any kind of moderate stretch knit, sweatshirt fleece, a fleece, even a double knit if you wanted to. You want to definitely consult the body measurements that are put on each envelope, such as here. But I will say though that you need to definitely consult the finished garment measurements, which some are usually here in this section on the back of the pattern, or you may also need to consult the actual tissue. So let's quickly have a recap of all of the pieces you are going to need. So first and foremost, you're going to need your upper front and upper side front pieces that we just finished altering. If you did this to the front and the back, or you did it to just the back or the front and vice versa, or wherever this is on your garment, make sure that you have those pieces accounted for. Again, you might not have it across the top of the front like I do, but just make sure wherever yours is at, you have those pieces. So we have the front pieces, the upper back pieces, middle front piece, middle back piece, your lower front piece, your lower back piece, hood piece, sleeve, your lower band, your sleeve band, front pocket if you decide that you want to do a front pocket. Now that you have all of your pieces done, we are ready to move on to cutting our fabric. So let's go ahead and prep our fabric for cutting. I'm going to be using a black double knit for the main body fabric, and then I'm going to have 2 contrasts. If you remember my sketch earlier, the blue sections are going to be this PVC vinyl fabric, and the red sections are also going to be a red PVC fabric. And you can see they're very shiny and slick, because we're also going for a very like edgy futuristic look, so I felt like these would be amazing for that. Just a note though, you want to make sure that you are choosing your fabric wisely. I highly recommend going with one of the fabrics that was suggested on your pattern envelope. Otherwise, if you've been sewing for a while and you're comfortable with veering off of those fabrics like I am here, then go for it. Once you have your patterns cut out, you're going to go ahead and transfer all of your markings to your fabric. In this case, I'm going to show you the lower front as an example. So we do have some notches that we need to clip into, and then some dots we need to transfer over. So what we're going to do for the notches is you're just going to take the tip of your scissor and just make a little snip into the fabric anywhere there is a notch, like so. And then for our dot, you're going to take pins and you're going to insert it into the size that you were using. In this case, I'm using a size small. You're going to do the other side the same way. You're going to take your pencil, your chalk pencil, and you are going to transfer over this dot by turning the pattern up against itself, taking your pencil and just making a little mark. And then once you can kind of see it, you can pull the pin out, go back and just darken that area just to make sure that you can see it. And just make sure that it's in the right spot and we're good. And then do the same thing for the other side. Before we head to the sewing machine, let's go ahead and run through the order of construction for this garment. Now, since my design has 2 upper front sections now, I'm going to stitch those together along the diagonal seam before stitching the lower edge to the middle front. Now, what I'm going to be doing also, since I'm working with vinyl and knit, is after I stitch the diagonal seam, I'm going to press the seam or move the seam so that it is facing towards the red vinyl here. This is so that I can actually have my seam allowance stay nice and flat and in place, because we can't technically press vinyl. After you sew that seam, you are going to take the lower edge and pin it to the middle front along this section and stitch that seam. Again, you are going to press the seam or move the seam so that it faces towards the vinyl if you are using vinyl in your design like I am. If not, you can go ahead and just press all of your seams flat and move on, or to one side. After you stitch this seam and top stitch, you are going to take the lower section of the middle front like this, and you are going to stitch this to the lower section or the lower front. But before you stitch this seam that connects the lower front to the middle front, you are going to have to add your patch pocket to the lower section if you are choosing to have a front pocket like I am. Once you have your pocket pinned and stitched onto your lower front, then you can go ahead and pin it to the middle front and stitch that seam. Now, also, if you are using vinyl like I am here, it is not smart to use regular pins, so I am going to be using Wonder Clips. These are actually technically made for quilting, but they work excellent for working for vinyl. And if you don't know how to use these, you're going to take your front piece, your lower front piece, for example, and lay it on top, right sides together, and then you'll take your Wonder Clips and you'll match all of your notches and just pin it, or not pin it, but clip it, I should say, like this. And you're gonna do this all the way across the edge as many times as you want. Then you'll be able to take this to your sewing machine and stitch it as you usually would, just making sure that you remove the clips before you get to them. After you have your full front piece and sewing together the pieces that need to be sewn depending on your design, you are going to repeat the process for the back pieces. Sew all of those together, and once you have your full back piece, you're going to pin it to the front at the shoulders, stitch your shoulders. After that, you are going to grab your sleeve pieces and insert your sleeves using the flat method. If you're not familiar with the flat method, I will be showing you this while we're sewing, but in essence, what we're doing is we're sewing the sleeve onto our armhole before we stitch our sides. After you do that and insert your sleeves using the flat method, then you will sew your side seams, starting from the wrist or the hem and going all the way up and down. At that point, you will go ahead and add your sleeve bands and your lower band. After you do that, the only thing left to do is to finish up with adding your hood. At that point, you'll be all done and our garment will be ready to wear. Now let's go ahead and head to the sewing machine. One other tip, if you are working with vinyl like I am here, is to use a non-stick or Teflon foot. I'm going to be top stitching my vinyl using the BERNINA 52D presser foot. This is so that my foot does not get hung up while stitching on the vinyl, and we can have nice smooth sewing. And this one in particular has the cutout for the dual feed, so I will be using this foot in conjunction with the dual feed. Now these presser feet actually come in quite a few different versions. Like there's a straight stitch one, there's one for inserting zippers. They're very helpful for sewing anything sticky, leather, vinyl, faux leather, anything like that. So now we're here at the sewing machine and I'm going to quickly get set up here. The first thing I'm going to do is switch out my current presser foot to my 52D foot. For your sewing machine settings, you are going to have to play around with these even though everybody's machine is different. I'm going to lessen my presser foot pressure, meaning the amount of pressure that's being put on the fabric, down to number 10, and I'm going to lessen my stitch length to 2.85. I usually sew at a 3. And also, you want to make sure that you're using good thread. I'm using just a regular all-purpose polyester thread for this. And once you have all of your machine settings up and running and you have tested a couple samples of pieces of fabric that you're using, we are good to go. So we're gonna go ahead and start stitching. I'm going to start with my 2 upper front pieces, but the whole idea is to make sure that you are sewing together all of the pieces that are making up the front of your hoodie. In this case, since I'm sewing with knit and vinyl, I'm going to be stitching so that the knit is towards the feed dog. So let's go ahead and start stitching. Also engage my dual feed, and it just lowers from the back of the machine just to make sure that we're having equal contact with the fabric also. Start stitching. And just sew slowly and make sure that you're not sewing too fast, because in my case, since I'm stitching on vinyl, if I make mistakes, then they're not reversible. So just take your time. Cut your thread. And this is what it'll look like. And you are also going to be sewing at 5/8 of an inch for every seam. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to take my seam and I'm going to push the seam allowance towards the vinyl. Like this, and we're going to top stitch all the way down. What I'm also going to do is move my stitch or my needle position over 2 notches and begin to stitch. Again, take your time, because since we're top stitching on vinyl, if you make a mistake, it's really hard to repair that. So take your time. You can also use your fingers to kind of flatten out the stitch line here, just so that you don't have any extra hangover. Because you also want a nice clean finish and a nice stitch. And then back stitch a little bit and cut. And this is what it'll look like. And this presser foot just allows you to glide right over this and have there not be any lumps or bumps. So, okay, so I realized that I actually grabbed the back piece first instead of the front, since I had said to sew the front pieces together. So I'm actually working with the back piece. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our upper back piece. So we've already sewn, or I've already sewn my section, and I'm going to pin it, or not pin it, but we're gonna clip it onto the upper back. So I'm going to lay them right on top of each other, clip them together, and then we are going to sew. And you are going to stitch with the knit towards the bottom, just to make sure that nothing gets stretched out on this side. Don't forget to move your needle position back to center, and then stitch. Back stitch at the end, and cut. And now what we're going to do is we are going to push this seam towards the lower, or the middle back, I should say. So go ahead and push your seam allowance to the blue side in this case, and top stitch. And there we go. Repeat this step to sew the middle back to the lower back. Then we can move on to the front. You are going to sew all of your front pieces together the same way we sewed all of our back pieces together. The only difference is that if you are using your patch pocket like I am, you need to sew on that pocket to the lower front before you can stitch it to the middle front. If you are not using your pocket, go ahead and sew the lower front to the middle front. Then at that point, we can go ahead and stitch our shoulders and then insert our sleeves. If you are using your pocket piece, this is how you do it. So you're going to take the pocket piece itself, and you're going to turn under the seam allowance 5/8 of an inch on the opening edges and on the side edges, like so. You're going to top stitch from the top, the edge down, and this will complete your pocket opening edge. The pressed under edges on the sides are going to go pinned onto your lower front section like I have here, matching the markings that we transferred when we cut our pieces. And you're going to also make sure that the edge matches with the dot that we transferred over earlier too. This is really important just to make sure that your pocket is centered on the actual lower front piece. And then at this point, you will go ahead and stitch the side edges down and then baste along the top edges. And then at that point, you'll be able to stitch your lower front to your upper front. Once you complete your lower front, this is what it will look like with the pocket stitched on. So we have the pocket opening edge here where your hand goes. And then I went ahead and used 2 rows of stitching for reinforcement purposes on the sides. And then I basted the upper edges and then the lower edges together, as you can see here. And this is for keeping the top and bottom edges in position as you stitch this piece to the middle front. Now it is time to stitch in our sleeves. So I went ahead and already stitched our front to our back. After you have matched all of your dots and your notches and have your sleeve pinned into the armhole, we are going to stitch with the sleeve towards the feed dog of the machine. This is so that any extra ease, kind of like how you see here, can be eased into the armhole without having to put in actual ease stitches. And the flat method, as we are doing here, just also offers a lot more comfortability in sewing in the sleeve before stitching the side seam. So let's go ahead and start stitching. And you're going to do this all the way until you get to the end. Now we have one sleeve stitched into the armhole, and what you'll want to do is after you sew the seam, just go ahead and go back through and make sure that there aren't any tucks or puckers. When you see that there aren't any tucks or puckers, this is how you know you did it correctly. Now, you can either just leave your seam allowance as it is, or you can also press it towards the sleeve. Sometimes what I'll do if I'm working with vinyl, as I am here, is I'll actually push the seam allowance towards the vinyl, or like towards the armhole, and then top stitch all the way around. But in this case, since I'm going for a more relaxed look, I'm just gonna leave this and just go ahead and press my seam allowance towards the sleeve. And then at this point, you can prep to sew your side seam. So what you are going to do is you are going to take your sides and match up your seam that connects the armhole to the garment. And you're going to match these 2 seams up, and you are going to secure it with a pin or a clip, as I am here. Match your notches on your sleeve, match your hem or your wrist edge on your sleeve. And once you have that, you can go ahead and start sewing. Usually I will start at the wrist and go all the way to the hem, or you can also start from the hem and go all the way to the wrist. Once you have this done, go ahead and repeat the last 2 steps of stitching your sleeve in and your side seam to the other side of the hoodie. So we are just about finished. The rest of this actually goes together pretty quickly. After you sew your side seams, you're going to go ahead and either press them to one side, press them open, or in this case, I pressed mine to one side, so towards the back, and did a top stitch. The only thing that I will say is if you're going to go the route of top stitching, the sleeve is kind of tricky because you're kind of sewing like in a tube, and then having to like wrestle it like into your machine. So obviously I would hope that you chose an easy fabric to where you can just press them open and go ahead and just move on to the next step. Grab both of your cuff pieces. You're going to sew them together, right sides facing like I have here. You're going to flip it inside out. I already have it flipped inside out, but you could see the inside. This is my seam here. And don't forget to stitch this at 5/8 of an inch. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take this rectangle piece that you have and you're going to simply fold it in half like this. And first thing, you want to make sure that both of your seams are going to match like so. And what I like to do is I like to place a few pins around the outer edges, and you definitely want to make sure that this seam doesn't end up like shifting. So you're gonna put a pin there first, and then just make sure that the edges are even. As you can see here, you know, we don't have any ripples or any extra fabric on one side or the other. Put a couple more pins, and you'll notice that we do have a notch. So there's gonna be a notch on the sleeve that this corresponds to. You're going to take that cuff piece and you're going to pin it to one side of the wrist like this, making sure that you match the notches and the side seams. And you're gonna see that these aren't quite even. You can see that this is the hoodie and this is the cuff. There's actually extra fabric in the hoodie because what we have to do is pull the cuff and stretch it to make it even like this. Since I'm using the same fabric as my hoodie, it's kind of a little bit of a challenge, but if you're using a rib knit, which is actually made for cuffs and bands, you can go ahead and use that. It'll make it quite easier to stretch it, because right now I'm kind of having to put a little bit of muscle in it. The kind of tricky part is getting it to stay matched up, so I'm gonna go ahead and just kind of use my my index and my middle finger to kind of pinch it in the center. Grab a pin and place it like so. Whoops, don't prick yourself like the way I just did. And what you can do is just kind of continue to stretch and make them even, because that's in essence what's going to happen is you have to stretch it to make these edges be the same. And in case you didn't know why, what's going to happen is once we sew this seam, once the fabric relaxes, it's going to make that band or the cuff snap up against your wrist or snap onto your wrist, creating that cuff band look that every hoodie that you've ever seen has. I'm going to place it so that I am sewing inside of the circle, so like in here, nice and slow. You're gonna sew all the way around and backstitch and cut your thread at the end. And this is what it'll look like. And I would suggest pressing the seam up towards the sleeve. You can also do a top stitch if you'd like. I'm just gonna leave mine like this and repeat this to the other side for your other sleeve and cuff. Grab your two lower band pieces and sew those two together like we did for the cuff. The only difference is that our lower bands have two side seams instead of just the one seam like our cuff did. So you're gonna sew those two together and you're going to fold them in half, give it a good press, and I went ahead and pinned the edge all the way around. Make sure that you have and see your notches because these are going to match up to the lower edge of our hoodie. And we're going to take your hoodie, and my hoodie right now is right side out, and I'm going to just put the band over the top. I'm gonna find my side seam of my hoodie and match it to the side seam of the cuff first, and I'm going to put a pin there. I would say place a pin on either side of the side seam. I'm doing both sides just to make sure that it stays. And just look back and make sure that your seams are matching, and you can see, well, maybe you can't see, but since I have black fabric, but the side seam of the band and the side seam of your hoodie should match up pretty accurately. And then you're going to go to the other side and find your other side seam and match it up with the side seam of the lower band. Put the lower edge of the hoodie inside of the band like so. You're going to find the notches that you should have on your lower edge of the hoodie and match it to the notches on the band itself. And you're going to do that for all 4 notches. You should have 4, 2 in the front and 2 in the back. And you'll see that like with our sleeve cuff, there's extra fabric here. So this edge is the front of our hoodie, and this is the band, the lower band. You're going to simply stretch it. You're going to stretch it, and with your fingers, just pinch and place a pin. You can stretch and place a pin again. Again, stretch and pin. While you're sewing, just like with the cuff, you're going to be stretching it to make it even and stitch it down all the way around. Once you've done that, we'll be ready to move on. Go ahead and grab your hood piece and put them right sides together, both pieces, and you're going to stitch down the center back. I've already done mine. Did 2 rows of top stitching on both sides of the seam. It's about 1/4 of an inch on both sides. This is just so that the seam stays nice and flat and pressed open, especially since this is an unlined hood. Next, what you're going to do is you are going to put in your grommets, or you can also put in buttonholes. But if you go this route of doing grommets, go ahead and follow your directions from the manufacturer. Get those in before you turn the edge under, and that would be the next step. Turn the edge back on the fold line. It's about 1.5 inches or so. Give it a good press, and we're going to just stitch this down from one end to the other, and this is what is going to create the casing for our drawstring. I'm going to go ahead and put this down on the machine, and what I'm going to be doing is actually using the farthest edge on my needle plate, this part, which is literally the end of it. But this is also to make sure that my presser foot can clear the grommet, because you don't want to get hung up on this. So go ahead and do that, and then we'll be good to go to pin this to the neck and get it sewn in. And just make sure that the edge stays lined up, so that way you get a nice even stitch, and you'll continue until you get to the other side. Once you get farther along, and just look back and make sure that you're catching the edge in your top stitch. You can see here that I still have a good amount of hangover, and yeah, we are in good shape, so you can go ahead and continue stitching. Once you have your hood sewn together, we're going to go ahead and pin it to the neckline. You're going to make sure that you match your dots on the hood to the shoulder seams of the hoodie, like I have here. Again, the dots go to the shoulder seam, and you're going to do that for the other side as well. And you're going to make sure that the ends of the hood, so the part where the grommet is, are butted up against each other at center front. And you also have a notch to make sure that you're in the right spot. You're going to also make sure that the center back seam of the hood matches up with the center back notch of the hoodie. Once you have it pinned in place, you're going to go ahead and start sewing at one of your shoulder seams and go all the way around, lapping your stitching and cutting your thread. After you have stitched your hood in, you're going to go ahead and press the seam towards the hoodie, and we're going to do a top stitch about 1/4 of an inch from the edge. So I'm going to go ahead and put this under my foot, and I went ahead and removed my extension table so that way we could use the free arm for this, just because it's a smaller area to sew in and we want to get nice and even stitching for this. So starting at one of my shoulders, and I'm going to move my needle position over 3 notches. And once you do that, you also might want to do a little bit longer of a stitch. You can do a 3, or in my case, I'm doing a 2.85. So go ahead and start stitching. And you can see that this free arm makes it super easy to get up and over trickier spaces like this neckline. And this top stitching will also just help the hood to stay in its correct spot and to not do anything funny while you're wearing it. And it also just makes a really nice professional finish. So you're gonna do this all the way around and then cut your thread. So after you've done your top stitching on your hood and made sure that it looks nice and even and everything is nice and flat and pressed, we are pretty much done. The next thing we're going to do, and our final step, is to insert our drawstring into the hood. Grab the trim that you're going to use for the drawstring. I have just a regular traditional like shoelace kind of trim. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my scissor and just clip off the end, so that way we start with a neat end like this. You're going to take a small safety pin. This is so that we can feed it through and hook it on one end, and just make sure that it's nice and secure and you don't put it too close to the edge. And we are going to insert it through one side, and you are going to pull it inside. And what you're going to do pretty much is you're going to have the safety pin in one hand inside the casing, and you're just going to slide fabric onto the safety pin, and with the other hand you're going to pull it, and this will pull your drawstring through all the way around. But yeah, this might take you a little while because the safety pin is a lot smaller. And yeah, you're just going to sift this on through until you come out of the other side. Once you have your drawstring fed through your casing, this is what it'll look like. And you have your strings come in. I went ahead and already cut mine to the length that I wanted, but what I am gonna do also is just kind of finish it off by tying it in a knot, because the ends of this do fray. So I'm gonna just leave this like so. And once you do that to the other side, you'll be good to go. We're all done. Congratulations for making it through my geometric hoodie sew along. I look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for watching.